Yaakov Azriel is an American-Israeli poet. He wrote a series of poems that serve as interpretations on biblical verses and concepts. At the end of this week's Torah portion, it is written that Moses took the book of the covenant and read it aloud in the hearing of the people, who responded, "All that the Eternal One has spoken we will do and obey." Na'aseh v'nishma, the famous phrase and concept in Judaism, which literally translates as "we will do" or act, na'aseh, and v'nishma, and we will listen or obey. In the market, past the alley of the shoemakers, at the stall of the booksellers, I perused and browsed until I came across a book whose pages spread out like tablecloth at the banquet, stretched like prophets' mantles, glided like eagle wings, whose sentences blossomed like fields of red anemones, swarmed like schools of dolphins, rose like flocks of sparrows, whose letters were jewels that adorned the palace of peril, hewn stones in a fortress wall, bricks which build a skyscraper. I entered the book, whose pages, sentences, and letters surrounded me like host of guardian angels, and I, overwhelmed by the light, discovered that book was a market, whose stalls were verses, whose wares were words. Jewish people are often called the people of the book, and it may seem that intellectual development and theoretical knowledge is more important than actions for Jewish people in Judaism. Yaakov Azriel compares the book where he found the divine light and angels with a market, a place which can only symbolize everyday busy routine. This week's Torah portion is Mishpatim. In it, we can find many detailed rules and commandments for everyday life, for as it was commanded for an ancient Jew. What strikes many readers of this portion is the contrast between this week and the last week's parashiot. Last week we read about Haseret Dibrot, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, the key principle and ethical foundation and for relationship with religion and society. This week, however, we read a long list of very specific rules, which at the first glance seem boring, endless, and pointless in contrast with the importance of the Ten Commandments. The list of Mishpatim begins with interpersonal laws ranging from the harsh treatment of slaves to the kind treatment of strangers. The portion also tells us about some agricultural commandments, such as sabbatical year, the first mention of the 3 pilgrim festivals, rules of sacrificial offerings, and the prohibition against boiling a kid in its mother's milk. Well, one may ask, if the 10 Commandments are the foundation for all other laws and the principle for Judaism, why list all these specific rules? We can never specify and prescribe all aspects of human life, or otherwise the book will be too long. Why wouldn't Torah stop at the main principles and let people to work out specifics for themselves, for their time, for their country, for their place of living? Medieval French Torah scholar Rashi comments on the first phrase of the first verse of the Torah portion Mishpatim. You will see it in a moment on your screen. And these are the laws, or the rules, that you shall set before them ואלה המשפטים אשר תשים לפניהם. Rashi notes that whenever Torah uses the word ele, these, it signals a disconnection from what has been written previously. However, whatever the Torah uses, the Torah text uses the term and these, va'ele, adding the conjunctive prefix vav, which means and, it signals a connection, a continuity with the previous chapter. Therefore, Rashi concludes that just as the former commands were given at Sinai and have the highest priority in Judaism, so these specific rules were given at Sinai too, and they are no less important than the general commandments and principles. In other words, just as the main principles of Judaism, Aseret Dibrot, the Ten Commandments, are divine, so are the details and regulations of everyday life. In the 1960s, the Danish architect, I hope I pronounce his name right, Arne Jacobsen, designed a new college campus in Oxford. Not only he designed the building, but he went on to design the cutlery and crockery to be used in the dining hall, as well as the small details in the college garden. When asked why, he replied, "Because God is in the details." It is easy to agree with Ten Commandments, which outline moral foundation and principles on a large scale. It is easy to have theoretical knowledge of an ideal world, where there is no murder, no theft, and everybody loves their parents and neighbors. But God and divine principles are not only in books and places of worship, but they are in marketplaces too. In the real world, where there is crime, false ideals, false gods, where people refuse to be free and choose slavery, where people engage in immoral practices and bear false witness. One day a week, we dedicate to thinking about ideals and trying to switch off from the daily routine of the real world. We call it Shabbat, a day of rest. We spend one day in contemplation and dreaming about the ideal world. But it will only work if we do our best to work hard for the rest of the week, making the real world a bit closer to the world of Shabbat, to the world of our dreams. One day a week we spend in an attempt to see a pure light, only to recognize and amplify it when we see a little spark of this light in the mix of everyday routine. May this Shabbat be such day of pure light, of dreams, inspiration and reflection. May this day of rest inspire us to see and bring this light to the rest of the world. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May this be God's will. Amen.